Mister, can you fix my toy? It was my last gift from Daddy. Maid's Toddler told the billionaire what he did shocked her. The morning Elena Vasquez arrived at Blackwood Manor for her first day of work, the fog was still wrapped around the iron gates like something that didn't want to let go. She stood at the entrance with her daughter perched on her hip, 3-year-old Rosie's dark curls pressed against her mother's cheek, tiny fingers clutching the strap of Elena's bag with a focused grip that toddlers reserve for the things they've decided matter most. Elena hadn't planned to bring Rosie. The plan had been her neighbor, Mrs. Huffman, watching the little girl while Elena completed her orientation at the Blackwood estate, where she'd been hired as part of the domestic staff, one of 6 maids responsible for maintaining the 32-room mansion that sat on the eastern edge of Millhaven, Connecticut. But Mrs. Huffman had called at 6 that morning with a fever of her own, and Elena had faced the particular kind of impossible math that single mothers have been calculating since the beginning of time: show up with the child or don't show up at all. She'd called the housekeeper, Mrs. Pratt, a brisk woman with steel-gray hair who communicated primarily through sighs. Mrs. Pratt had not sighed warmly, but she'd said yes, with the caveat that the child was to be seen and not heard, was not to touch anything, and was under no circumstances to go near the East Wing where Mr. Blackwood maintained his personal offices. Understood, Elena had said. She'd said it the way she said most things these days, quietly, practically, with the part of herself that had learned to take up less space. That part had grown larger over the past 2 years, since Daniel died. Rosie didn't know much about death. She was 3, and 3-year-olds understand the world primarily through texture and repetition and the reliable appearance of the people they love. What Rosie understood was that Daddy used to be there every morning and then one day he wasn't, and Mommy's face did a new thing sometimes when she thought Rosie wasn't looking, a kind of folding inward like a paper crane collapsing back into a flat square. What Rosie did know, with absolute certainty, was the music box. It was small and oval, pale pink with a ballerina that spun when you wound the key on the bottom, and it played a tinkling, imperfect version of Swan Lake that Daniel had always hummed slightly off-key while he danced Rosie around the kitchen. He'd given it to her the week before the accident, one of those spontaneous, no-occasion gifts that parents give when something in them knows, even if their mind doesn't. A Sunday afternoon, a toy shop they'd passed on a walk, a daughter who'd pressed her nose to the glass. Last one in the store, Daniel had said, handing it to her. Must have been waiting for you. The ballerina had stopped spinning 4 months ago. The mechanism inside had broken. Elena didn't know how, only that one morning Rosie had wound the key and nothing happened, and the little girl had looked up at her mother with an expression no 3-year-old should know how to make. Elena had taken it to a repair shop downtown. The man behind the counter had turned it over in his hands, looked at her over his glasses, and said he didn't do music boxes anymore. Too fiddly. Not worth the time. She'd tried 2 other shops. Same answer, different words. So the music box sat on Rosie's windowsill, silent and waiting, and Rosie carried the grief of it the way children carry things. Openly, without armor, occasionally asking questions that made Elena's throat close. Mama, can we fix it? I'm trying, baby. Is Daddy sad it's broken? There wasn't a good answer to that one. Elena had learned to redirect, to say something soft and sideways that moved them toward breakfast or bath time or sleep. She'd become skilled at the gentle pivot. It was one of the many skills grief had given her that she'd never asked for. She hadn't meant to bring the music box to Blackwood Manor either. It had been in the outer pocket of her bag. Rosie had put it there that morning, insisting with the totalitarian confidence of a toddler that it needed to come. Elena hadn't had the energy to argue. She'd had approximately 40 minutes of sleep and 2 cups of coffee and a daughter who was already dressed and ready while Elena was still trying to find matching shoes. So the music box came. Blackwood Manor was the kind of house that made you feel small even if you weren't already feeling that way. The entry hall alone was larger than the apartment Elena and Rosie shared in the Millhaven Lower District. Marble floors the color of winter clouds, a chandelier that looked like someone had frozen a waterfall mid-fall, walls hung with art that didn't try to be friendly. Mrs. Pratt met them at the door with a clipboard and the expression of a woman who had decided to be patient but wanted you to know it was costing her. "She can sit in the kitchen during your orientation," Mrs. Pratt said, looking at Rosie the way people sometimes look at weather, acknowledging it without welcoming it. "There's a corner near the window. Keep her there." "Of course," Elena said. Rosie, for her part, looked around the entry hall with the unguarded wonder of a child who hasn't yet learned that magnificence should be intimidating. She craned her neck back to look at the chandelier. She pressed her palm flat against the marble floor. She said with great seriousness, "It's cold, Mama." "I know, love." "Like a castle." "Kind of like that, yes." The kitchen was warmer, all stainless steel and natural light, smelling of coffee and the ghost of that morning's breakfast. One of the other maids, a young woman named Petra, set Rosie up in the window corner with a glass of apple juice and a butter cookie and the kind of immediate, uncomplicated kindness that some people carry in them like a reflex. Elena watched her daughter settle, small legs dangling from a tall chair, cookie in both hands, and felt the complicated mixture of love and guilt and exhaustion that was the private climate of single motherhood. Then she turned to follow Mrs. Pratt and pay attention to the things she needed to pay attention to: the schedule, the supply closet, the list of rooms she was responsible for, the rules of the house. The most important rule, Mrs. Pratt reiterated, was the East Wing. "Mr. Blackwood works from home most days," she said, with a formality that suggested this was not a small thing. "He is not to be disturbed. He values his privacy absolutely. If you encounter him, you greet him politely and continue with your work. You do not ask questions. You do not linger." Elena nodded. This was not a complicated instruction. She was good at not lingering. What neither of them could have predicted, what no reasonable orientation checklist could have accounted for, was a 3-year-old with a broken music box and the directional instincts of someone guided by something larger than common sense. By 10:45 that morning, Rosie was gone from her corner. By 11, Elena's heart was somewhere in her shoes. And somewhere in the East Wing of Blackwood Manor, a billionaire who had not smiled in longer than he could accurately remember was about to open a door and find the smallest, most serious person he'd ever encountered standing in his hallway, holding a broken pink music box in both hands like an offering. Nathan Blackwood had 33 years of living, and almost none of it had been soft. That wasn't self-pity, it was accounting. Nathan was, above most things, precise. He'd built Blackwood Capital from a converted garage and a spreadsheet, and the particular ruthlessness that comes not from cruelty, but from having learned very early that the world does not pause for sentiment. His father had taught him that, mostly by example. A man who'd run through 2 fortunes and 3 families and left each one a little more hollowed out than he'd found it. Nathan had watched and learned, and decided to become the opposite in every measurable way. He'd succeeded. By 26, he was worth more than his father had ever dreamed of squandering. By 30, he was the subject of magazine profiles that used words like visionary and relentless and occasionally, in the less flattering pieces, cold. He'd read those profiles the way he read most things, analytically extracting what was useful, discarding the rest. He lived alone in Blackwood Manor, which had been his grandmother's house, and was the one inheritance he'd actually wanted, not for its size or its value, but because his grandmother, Eleanor Blackwood, had been the one soft thing in his childhood. She died 6 years ago and left him the house and a handwritten note that said only, "Don't let it get too quiet in there, Nathan." He hadn't been able to honor that particular request. The manor had gotten very quiet. He kept a staff because the house required it, but he maintained distance from them the way he maintained distance from most things that weren't work, not unkindly, just completely. Mrs. Pratt ran the household with excellent efficiency, and they communicated primarily through notes and the occasional brief, professional exchange. The other staff he saw occasionally in hallways, nodded to, continued past. He was not unhappy. He'd examined the question carefully, the way he examined everything, and concluded that what he was simply contained. functional, optimized for productivity and minimized for disruption. Whether that constituted happiness was a philosophical question he'd tabled indefinitely. This particular Tuesday morning, he was at his desk by 7, which was standard, working through the Q3 projections for a renewable energy acquisition that had become unexpectedly complicated. The East Wing office was his favorite room in the house, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a desk that had been his grandmother's, windows that faced the garden which at this time of year was all bare branches and frozen ground, but which in summer produced roses so extravagant they seemed slightly embarrassed by themselves. He worked without music, without the television on in the background, without the ambient noise that most people required to feel comfortable inside their own heads. Nathan had spent enough time inside his head to be neutral about the company. At 11 o'clock, he got up to refill his coffee from the small setup he kept in the East Wing sitting room, a concession to efficiency, so he didn't have to make the trip to the main kitchen and encounter the ordinary friction of other human beings in the middle of a workday. He was coming back down the East Wing corridor, mug in hand, thinking about leverage ratios, when he almost stepped on her. He didn't step on her. His reflexes were good, and he stopped in time, sloshing coffee over his hand, which was hot enough to make him hiss sharply, and then he looked down. She was standing in the middle of the corridor with the settled posture of someone who had arrived at a decision and was comfortable with it. Dark curls, round cheeks still carrying the particular softness of very early childhood, enormous dark eyes that looked up at him with no fear whatsoever. Only the calm, evaluating regard of a person assessing whether you were the right sort of help for their particular problem. She was holding something in both hands. Pink. Oval. A music box, he realized, though it took him a moment because it had been a long time since he'd encountered one. He stared at her. She stared back. This standoff lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than most people maintained eye contact with Nathan Blackwood without looking away first. Then she held the music box up toward him, a gesture so deliberate it was almost formal, and said in a voice that was small but absolutely clear, "Mister, can you fix my toy? It was my last gift from Daddy." The words landed somewhere in Nathan's chest in a way he wasn't prepared for. Not because they were dramatic. She delivered them with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who hasn't learned yet that some statements require softening, but because of the specific weight of that word in her small mouth. Last. He crouched down to her level, which put him close enough to see that her eyes were slightly shiny in the way that could tip either direction, toward tears or toward acceptance, depending on what happened next. "Can I look at it?" he said. His voice came out different than he expected. Quieter. She considered him for a moment longer, then handed it over with the gravity of someone transferring something precious. He turned it in his hands. The mechanism, he could feel it when he wound the key, was catching on something. Probably a bent tooth in the gear, or a spring that had slipped its housing. He'd taken apart his grandmother's mantel clock at age 9 and put it back together successfully, and in the intervening years had developed the habit of understanding how things worked at their smallest level. It was the same instinct that made him good at business, the refusal to accept broken as a final answer. "What's your name?" he asked, still examining the base. "Rosie," she said. "I'm Nathan. You live here?" "I do." She absorbed this. "It's cold," she said, with the tone of someone offering useful feedback. "I know. I'll turn the heat up." He didn't know why he said that. He did intend to do it, he realized immediately, which was strange, because the temperature of the manor had not felt like something that required adjustment until approximately 30 seconds ago. "Can you fix it?" Rosie asked again. Not impatiently. Just clearly, because this was the important question, and she wanted to make sure it hadn't gotten lost. Nathan looked at the music box. He looked at the little girl. He thought about the word last, and what it implied about a father, and about what this child was carrying in her 3 years on Earth. "I'm going to try very hard," he said. He meant it the way he meant most things, completely. That was the moment Elena appeared at the far end of the corridor, her face the color of fresh panic, her eyes going from her daughter to the man crouched beside her and back again with the rapid calculation of someone assessing disaster. "Rosie," she breathed. "Oh God, Rosie, I'm so sorry." She was moving toward them quickly, apology already forming in the set of her shoulders. "Mr. Blackwood, I am so sorry." She was in the kitchen and I turned around. "She knows she's not supposed to be in this wing. I promise you this won't." "It's all right," Nathan said. Elena stopped. He stood up, the music box in one hand, and looked at her properly for the first time. 28, he'd guess, with the particular kind of tiredness in her eyes that isn't about sleep. Dark hair pulled back practically. A steadiness to her even in the middle of obvious alarm that suggested she'd had to be steady for a long time. "She wasn't in any danger," he said. "She was very polite." He glanced at Rosie. She asked nicely. Rosie nodded, confirming this. Elena looked at the music box in his hand, and something moved across her face. Complicated and fast, gone before he could name it. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," Nathan said. "I want to try." He sent Rosie back to the kitchen with Elena, gently, with a seriousness toward the child that Elena noticed, the way you notice unexpected things, sharply and with something like confusion, and then he went to the storage room adjacent to his office where he kept the tools. His grandmother had called it the tinkering room. It was where young Nathan had learned to take things apart and put them back together, first under her supervision and then alone, during the long boarding school holidays when the manor was otherwise empty. Eleanor Blackwood had believed, philosophically, that understanding how things worked at their interior was the most important education a person could receive. She'd been correct. The tinkering room had shaped him more than any classroom. He found his precision screwdrivers, his watchmaker's loop, a small set of files. He carried them to his desk and set the music box down under the desk lamp and opened the base panel. The mechanism was a standard cylinder movement, a rotating brass cylinder with pins that plucked the tines of a steel comb to produce the notes. He could see immediately what had happened. One of the small governing weights had come loose and fallen against the cylinder, jamming the rotation. It hadn't broken anything. It just needed to be reset and secured. The relief he felt was disproportionate to the situation, and he was self-aware enough to recognize that. He worked carefully, with the concentration he brought to everything that mattered. He reset the weight, checked the main spring tension, examined each tine of the comb for damage, found one slightly bent, a high note that would have been slightly flat, and spent 20 minutes with a fine file correcting it by degrees, testing after each pass by gently flicking the tine and listening. The ballerina mechanism he checked separately. The small cam that drove her rotation was fine, only needing the jam cleared. At 12:30, he wound the key. The ballerina rose. She turned. Swan Lake filled the quiet office, slightly imperfect and completely right. Nathan sat back in his chair and looked at the spinning dancer and heard the music his grandmother used to play on her old record player on winter Sundays, and felt something in his chest do something complicated that he didn't examine too carefully. He was going back to the kitchen to return it when he passed Mrs. Pratt in the hallway, who looked at the music box and then at him with an expression he couldn't quite classify. "The maid's daughter," she said. It wasn't a question. "Elena's daughter," he said. He wasn't sure why he corrected that. He just had. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the lunch Petra had apparently produced. Soup, from the smell, something with tomatoes. Rosie was back in her corner seat, drawing on a piece of paper Petra had found, her tongue slightly out with concentration. Elena was cleaning something across the room and turned when he came in, her expression recalibrating rapidly. The other kitchen staff, Petra and a man named Cobb, who managed the pantry, went very still in the particular way that staff go still when the employer enters unexpectedly. Nathan barely registered it. He crossed to Rosie's corner and set the music box on the table in front of her. "Try the key," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the box. She reached out with both hands and wound the key with the careful focus of someone who had wound it many times before and had learned not to hope too much. The ballerina rose. The music started. Rosie's face. He would think about it later, in the quiet of his office, and then again in the quiet of his bedroom, and then again in the particular quiet of 3 in the morning when the things you've seen during the day come back, without your permission. He would think about what happened to her face. It opened. That was the only word for it. It opened like something that had been held closed by a hand that had just let go, every muscle releasing at once, eyes going bright and wide, mouth rounding, a sound escaping that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a cry, but was somewhere in the compressed space between joy and grief, where children go when they feel the full weight of something they love. "Mama," she breathed. "Mama, it works. Mama, it works." Elena had crossed the room without Nathan seeing her move. She was crouching beside Rosie's chair, her hands cupping her daughter's face, and when Nathan looked at her he saw that she was crying, quickly, quietly, with the practiced restraint of someone who had learned to do their most necessary crying in the margins of other things. "I know, baby," Elena said. Her voice held. "I know. Daddy's song," Rosie said. She said it simply, to her mother, as if this was a complete explanation of everything, which, Nathan understood, it was. He stood very still in the warm kitchen and felt the edges of something he had no name for pressing against the inside of his chest. "Thank you," Elena said. She looked up at him from where she crouched beside Rosie, and her eyes were dark and bright, and entirely unguarded in the way that people are when something has bypassed all their careful defenses. "I don't, Mr. Blackwood. I don't have the right words. I've been trying to get it fixed for months." "It was a simple repair," he said. "It wasn't a simple repair. He'd spent 90 minutes on it." "He didn't say that." "It wasn't simple to us," she said quietly. "It was everything." The music box played on, tinkling and slightly imperfect and absolutely irreplaceable, while a 3-year-old with her father's last gift held in both hands listened to a song she'd thought she'd lost, and a billionaire who had optimized his entire life for containment stood in his own kitchen feeling something stubbornly, persistently uncontained. He didn't think he'd seek them out again. That wasn't a decision exactly, more an assumption, the way he assumed most things about his own behavior. He was a person who had trained himself to pass through his own life with minimal disruption, and what had happened in the kitchen was the kind of disruption that his system usually processed and filed and moved away from efficiently. Instead, on Wednesday, he found himself taking his afternoon coffee in the main kitchen rather than his East Wing setup, for the first time in the 3 years he'd lived full-time at the manor. Rosie was there. Elena was somewhere else in the house. Wednesday was the day the second-floor guest rooms were done. Mrs. Pratt had once mentioned this in a scheduling context, and apparently he'd retained it. Rosie was in her corner with her drawing paper, the music box on the table beside her, playing softly on a loop as she drew. She looked up when he came in. "Hi, Mr. Nathan," she said. "Hello, Rosie." He went to the coffee maker. "What are you drawing?" "A horse," she said, with the confidence of an artist who knows their own vision. Nathan looked at the paper. It was aggressively abstract. He decided to believe her. "I like it," he said. "It's for Mama." She returned to the drawing with focused intensity. She likes horses. She used to ride them. He didn't know why this detail lodged in him. Elena Vasquez, who moved through his house with careful efficiency and apologized for occupying space, who had once ridden horses. It was a reminder that people are larger than the versions of themselves circumstance currently requires them to be. "Do you want some juice?" he asked. She looked up. "Yes, please," she said, with great formality, as if they had arrived at a business arrangement. He got her juice. He sat at the kitchen table, not in his customary remove, but at the actual table, with his coffee, while a 3-year-old drew a horse beside him and Swan Lake played quietly from a pink music box. He stayed for 40 minutes. It was, he would think later, the most peaceful 40 minutes he'd had in longer than he could accurately place. Elena found them when she came back for Rosie's lunch, stopped in the kitchen doorway with the same rapid recalibration he'd seen from her before, the quick, quiet processing of unexpected information. "She's been keeping me company," Nathan said. She's good at that, Elena said carefully. There was something in the way she was watching him, not suspicion, exactly. More like the attentiveness of someone who's been surprised before and has learned to understand surprises before trusting them. He respected that. He recognized it actually from the inside. Over the following week, it became a pattern without either of them naming it as one. He would appear in the kitchen at some point during the day. Rosie would be there. He would sit. She would chatter about the horse drawing, which had evolved into an entire series, about a bird she'd seen in the garden that morning, about her friend at the church nursery who had boots shaped like frogs, about Daddy, occasionally and without announcement, the way children bring up the things they carry, just setting them on the table between you the way they'd set any object down, not requiring anything from you but your presence. He learned that Daniel had been a teacher, that he'd loved old movies and made pancakes on Sundays in the shapes of animals, and that he used to call Rosie his best adventure. He learned these things not because Elena told him. Elena was still careful around him, still apologized for existing in his space more than she needed to, but because Rosie told him, in the digressive, associative way that 3-year-olds tell things, so that the whole picture assembled itself gradually, like something coming into focus. On Friday of that week, he found Elena alone in the first-floor library, which was on her cleaning schedule, dusting the shelves with the systematic thoroughness he'd noticed she brought to everything. She didn't hear him come in. He stood for a moment watching her work, the focused quietness of her, the competence, and felt oddly reluctant to interrupt. He must have made some sound because she turned, startled, and immediately began apologizing. "Please stop apologizing," he said. It came out more direct than he intended, but she stopped. She looked at him. "You work here," he said. "You're allowed to be in rooms." "I know," she said. And then, quietly, "I'm sorry." "I know." A small, self-aware smile at that. She'd apologized for apologizing, and knew it. He almost smiled. He wasn't certain because smiling had become somewhat unfamiliar, but something happened on the edges of his face that felt like it might be the beginning of one. "Your daughter told me you used to ride horses," he said. Elena blinked. "She did. She was drawing you one. For a gift." Something warm and helpless moved across Elena's face, that specific expression parents get when their children do something loving without calculation, the pure ambush of being loved simply. Elena started and stopped. Started again. "She's the best person I know. I'm biased. But I think it's also objectively true." "I think you might be right," Nathan said. They looked at each other for a moment, carefully, from their respective distances, like two people who've been alone for a long time and have forgotten the precise mechanics of being otherwise. "The music box," Elena said. "I've been trying to find the right way to say what that meant. To her. To me." She looked down at the duster in her hands. Her father gave it to her the week before the accident. It was the last time things were, before everything changed. And when it broke, it felt like losing that again. The last piece of something. She looked up. "You gave it back. I don't know how to weight that." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I just fixed a mechanism," he said finally. "You fix more than that," she said simply. Not as flattery, just as the accurate thing. He nodded once, and left the library, and stood in the hallway for a moment with his hand flat against the wall, feeling something he hadn't felt in a very long time, the unfamiliar, necessary weight of having been seen saying something true. 3 weeks after Rosie first appeared in his hallway, Nathan Blackwood did something he hadn't done since his grandmother was alive. He opened the garden. Not literally, the garden was always accessible. But there was a difference between the garden existing as a feature of the property and the garden being used, which was a distinction he understood the moment he heard himself asking Mrs. Pratt whether the paths had been cleared of ice that morning and whether they were passable for a child. Mrs. Pratt looked at him with an expression he'd never seen on her face before, which he eventually identified as surprise achieving the level of open visibility. "They are," she said. "I'll have Cobb put down some sand on the north path." "Thank you," he said. He found Elena at the start of her morning break and asked if Rosie might like the garden. He asked it formally, which was the only register he was completely fluent in, and watched Elena's face process the question and whatever she thought it might mean. "She'd love that," Elena said finally. She's been watching the birds from the kitchen window every morning. It was a cold day, but still, silver sky, bare trees, the garden formal and quiet under its winter dormancy. Nathan walked them out through the side door, Rosie between them in a red coat Elena had produced from her bag with the preparedness of a mother who understands that opportunity appears without much notice and you have to have the coat. Rosie went immediately to the frozen fountain at the center of the garden and pressed her mittened hands against the ice, peering through it. "There's things in there," she announced. "Leaves." "In summer there are fish," Nathan said. She looked up at him with sudden, intense interest. "Fish in the fountain? Gold ones." She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Can I come back in summer?" He looked at Elena, who was looking at her daughter, who was radiating the complete, uncalculating hopefulness that children express before the world teaches them to be strategic about wanting things. "Yes," Nathan said. He said it before he'd thought about what it implied, and then after he'd said it, he found that he didn't want to unsay it. Elena turned to look at him. He met her eyes and held them, which was something he hadn't done with another person in a long time without it being about business. "Yes," he said again more quietly. "For her this time." They walked the north path, Rosie ahead of them at the particular teetering run of a 3-year-old negotiating uneven ground, stopping every few feet to investigate something, a frozen puddle, an interesting stone, a cluster of dried seed heads on a dead stalk that she touched with one finger as if testing whether they were real. Nathan found himself talking. This was unusual enough that he noticed it the way you notice a sound in a quiet house. He talked about his grandmother, the roses she'd grown, the colors, the fact that Eleanor had known the name of every variety and had walked him through them when he was small, naming them like old friends. He talked about the mantel clock he'd repaired at 9 and the way she'd praised him, not effusively but specifically, pointing to exactly what he'd done well, which was, he'd always thought, the highest form of praise. Elena walked beside him and listened, which she did with her whole attention, and occasionally said things that showed she'd heard him, really heard him, the inside parts, not just the words. It was disorienting in the best way, like walking a path you assumed was even and finding it had unexpected depths. "You miss her," Elena said, after he'd described Eleanor's habit of reading aloud on winter evenings, to herself and whoever was nearby. "Every day," he said. He said it simply, because it was simply true. They walked quietly for a moment. "I miss Daniel that way," Elena said. "It's the small things. The specific habits. Nobody tells you it's going to be the specific habits." She paused. He used to sing completely wrong lyrics to every song. Confidently. He never admitted he didn't know the words. He'd just invent them. Rosie used to think his versions were the real ones. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh, and almost something else. She still sometimes sings his made-up lyrics. Nathan looked at her. "That's the kind of thing that's irreplaceable," he said. "Yes," she said. She looked at him with the directness she'd been gradually extending to him over the past weeks, this careful trust, offered incrementally. "Yes, that's exactly it." Rosie had found a bird. It was a small brown thing on a branch near the garden wall, and she had gone completely still beneath it. The preternatural stillness that children can access when they're wrapped, all their restless energy condensed into absolute focus. She was watching it with her head tilted and her mittens clasped together and her breath making small clouds. Nathan and Elena stood slightly behind her and watched her watch the bird. "She's extraordinary," Nathan said quietly. "I know," Elena said, just as quietly. "I had nothing to do with it. She came like this." The bird sang something brief and precise, a few notes against the cold air, and flew. Rosie turned around with her face incandescent. "Did you hear it?" she demanded. "We heard it," Nathan said. She ran back to them across the frosted path, reaching up, automatically, with the instinct of small children for the nearest available hand, and took Nathan's hand in both of her mittened ones. He went very still. She didn't notice. She was already turning to point out the tree where the bird had been, explaining something about birds that was only partially coherent, but completely committed to. His hand was enclosed in her small grip, and she held it with the casual confidence of someone who had made a decision and didn't require his confirmation. He looked at Elena. She was watching him with something in her expression that was completely open and completely undefended, and her eyes were bright again. And this time, she didn't look away. Spring came to Millhaven the way springs do, not all at once, but in arguments, cold days insisting against warm ones until the warm days simply outnumbered them. The garden at Blackwood Manor came back the way Nathan's grandmother had always described it, reluctantly, then all at once, then embarrassingly. The roses were the last to arrive. They always were. But on a Sunday morning in late April, the first buds appeared on the old climber against the south garden wall, small, tight, the specific pink of something about to become itself, and Nathan came to find Elena to show her, which had become the thing he did when something in the house or garden happened that felt like it belonged to more than just him. She was in the kitchen garden with Rosie, who had been given a small trowel by Nathan 3 weeks ago and had been conducting what she described as planting with great authority ever since. Whether what she was planting would grow was, Nathan had assessed, geologically uncertain. But the activity gave her enormous satisfaction, and he decided that was sufficient. "The roses are starting," he told Elena. She looked up at him and smiled. The full one, not the careful one she'd arrived with. Over 3 months, he'd mapped the difference. The full smile involved the edges of her eyes and meant she dropped her guard, and he'd done nothing to deserve seeing it the first time, but had worked quietly and consistently since to deserve it again. "She'll want to see," Elena said, looking at Rosie. "I know," Nathan said. "That's why I came." Rosie required minimal convincing. She came with her trowel, a non-negotiable, and they walked the 3 of them through the garden to the south wall, and Rosie stood in front of the first rose buds with her trowel held at her side like a scepter and looked at them with the assessment of someone who had formed opinions about gardens over a winter of careful observation. "They're pink," she said. "They are," Nathan confirmed. "Like my music box." "I noticed that too." She seemed to consider this connection significant, the way children find meaning in correspondences that adults have learned to dismiss as coincidence. He'd come to think she might be right that they weren't coincidences, or rather, that the question of whether they were didn't matter as much as the noticing. They'd been walking this garden every week since the January morning he'd first brought them out. It had started formally, scheduled, and then become simply what they did on Sunday mornings, Nathan and Elena walking the paths while Rosie classified everything she encountered as either interesting, very interesting, or extremely interesting, and the winter had slowly, reluctantly, then suddenly become spring. Things had shifted between Nathan and Elena with the same gradual inevitability. Not quickly, neither of them were people who moved quickly toward things they might not be able to unchoose. But he'd come to know her the way you come to know someone when you pay attention over time. The way she thought through problems out loud in a low voice when she didn't know you were listening, the way she laughed at things she found absurd, the books she borrowed from his library and returned with the expressions on her face, giving away exactly which parts had gotten to her. The precise, specific ways she loved her daughter, not generally as a category but exactly in the particular language of Rosie. And Elena had come to know him. He'd felt it, the moment when her carefulness around him stopped being distance and became instead the particular attention of someone who is interested, which is a different thing entirely, though it can look similar from outside. He hadn't said anything directly. He was 33 and had been professionally fluent in complexity and personally inarticulate about the things that mattered since approximately forever. But there were conversations where the space between them felt thin in the way that certain spaces do when something is on both sides of them pressing to get through. This morning, while Rosie communed with the rose buds, Elena stood beside him and he was aware of her in the way he'd become aware of her, completely, peripherally, the way you're aware of a source of warmth in a cold room. "I've been thinking," she said, not looking at him, her eyes on the garden. "About whether this," she paused. He waited because he'd learned that she needed the pauses, that she was precise about language, and the pauses were where she found the right words. "Whether I've allowed this situation to become something it shouldn't be. For Rosie especially. She's," another pause. "She loves it here. She loves the garden. She talks about the fish." A complicated breath. "She talks about you." He was quiet. "And I've let that happen," Elena continued, "because it's been," she stopped. Started again with more precision. "You have been so kind to us." And Rosie she needed exactly what she's found here, which was someone who treated her like she was worth taking seriously, which you did from the first minute. Her voice had gone slightly unsteady. "So, I let it happen. And now I'm trying to figure out if I did that for her or for me. Can it be both?" Nathan said. She looked at him. "Can it be that she needed it and so did you?" he said. "Can both things be true?" Elena looked at him for a long, still moment. "I'm not a complicated situation to be kind about," she said carefully. "I'm not a charitable case. If that's—" "Elena," he said. He said her name the way he'd been saying it for weeks in his own head, directly, without management. "I repaired a music box. Everything since then has been completely voluntary. Do you understand that?" She was quiet. "I haven't done a single thing," he said, "that I didn't want to do. Not the garden. Not the Sundays. Not any of it." He looked at her. "I don't know how to say what this has been for me. I've been living in this house like it was a very large and well-appointed office, and then your daughter walked into my hallway and handed me something that was broken and asked me to fix it, and I don't." He stopped. He found the honest thing. "I don't think she was only talking about the music box." Elena's breath caught. Rosie, by the roses, had begun explaining something to the buds. She did this. Addressed plants and animals and objects with the same courtesy she'd extend to people, on the philosophical principle, apparently, that everyone deserved to be spoken to. "She's going to be extraordinary," Nathan said, watching her. "She already is," Elena said. Her voice had gone soft. "So are you," he said quietly. She looked at him. The full look, nothing withheld. "I don't know what to do with that," she admitted. "Neither do I," he said. "Exactly. I don't know precisely what this is, or where it goes. But I know that Sunday mornings are the thing I look forward to most in my week, and I know that this house has not been quiet in the way it was before, and I know that I went from having no idea what was in my garden to knowing where every bird has its territory because a 3-year-old has been cataloging them since January." He paused. "I know that I fixed a music box, and it fixed something in me. And I know I'm not saying any of this very well." "You're saying it fine," Elena said. Her eyes were bright. "Mr. Nathan," Rosie announced from the rose bed. She had turned to face them, trowel raised. "I think the flowers heard me." "I think they did," Nathan said. "They're going to be very big," she told him authoritatively. "Very big," he agreed. She nodded, satisfied, and turned back to continue the conversation. Elena made a sound beside him, the full laugh, the unguarded one, and it was warm in the cold April air, and he turned toward it the way everything turns toward warmth without making a decision to. "Thank you," she said softly, still smiling. "For all of it. The music box. The garden. The fish she keeps talking about. They'll be back in the fountain next month," he said. "She can name them." Elena looked at him, with her whole face, all of it, nothing managed or performed. "She'll name them all," she said. "She'll name them all and insist they know their names." "I'll learn them," he said. And he meant it the way he meant things now, not as performance or strategy, but as the simple statement of a man who had been handed a broken thing by the smallest, most serious person he'd ever met, and had discovered in the repairing of it that he was the one who had needed fixing. The garden grew around them, reluctant, and then all at once, then embarrassingly, exactly as his grandmother had always promised it would. And Rosie spoke to the roses, and the roses, in the way of roses, listened. And some things come to us broken, so we'll understand what we're mending isn't just the object,